The first round landed just after 2:40 in the morning, not close enough to take a life, but close enough to snap the base awake in a way that never fades. I was standing beside a maintenance shed, half in shadow, wearing civilian clothes, holding a cup of coffee that went cold in my hand. The air tightened, like the ground itself had gone still to listen. Someone yelled to turn the lights on. Someone else shouted to keep them off. Radios crackled once, twice, then fell silent. And underneath all of it came the sound I had spent years trying to forget. That slow, hollow thump of indirect fire walking closer with purpose. I was not supposed to be there. I was just a sister visiting before my brother rotated out. No rank, no weapon, no authority. But my body did not care about any of that. It started counting seconds, measuring distance, tracking angles. Old habits do not wait for permission. When the second explosion dropped inside the wire and a guard tower went dark, I understood something that settled heavy in my chest. This was not chaos. This was preparation. And if nobody broke the pattern soon, a lot of people were not going to see morning. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Hannah Mercer. In the year 2011, I was supposed to be done with war. I had left the service 3 years earlier, after a stretch of work that never made it onto paper and never showed up in photos. When people asked what I did back then, I kept it simple. I said I had been in the Army. I said I got out. Both were true. Neither explained much. I taught self-defense in a small town outside Clearwater Ridge, Oregon. It was quiet country. Pine trees, long roads, neighbors who waved and meant it. I liked teaching people how to notice exits, how to trust their instincts, how to avoid fights instead of winning them. That life was not an accident. I built it carefully, like something fragile. I slept better there. I learned how to be ordinary on purpose. Luke used to joke that I moved as if the ground might betray me. He was my younger brother by 4 years, which meant he grew up watching me leave and come back changed. He never asked about the details. He just decided to follow his own path. By 2011, he was a first lieutenant stationed at Redfield Support Base. He had 3 days left before rotating forward, and I told myself that was the only reason I was visiting. I needed to see him standing on his own 2 feet before the waiting started. Redfield sat on the edge of an old industrial zone outside a Midwestern town. Most people passed without noticing. Empty warehouses, rusted rail spurs, wind pushing dust through broken windows. The base itself was stitched into what used to be a manufacturing complex, reinforced with wire, sandbags, and watchtowers that looked sturdy until you studied them too long. The guard at the checkpoint barely glanced at my identification. He waved me through with a tired smile. That detail stayed with me. Not because he was careless, but because he was comfortable. Comfort is expensive in the wrong place. Luke met me near the administrative building, grinning like we were still kids. He looked older than I remembered. Not worn down, just sharpened. We hugged longer than usual. I felt his ribs under the uniform. I felt how fast his heart was moving. He told me he was fine. I told him I believed him. Redfield was not a combat base. It housed logistics, maintenance, and transit units. Mechanics, supply clerks, drivers, people who kept things moving so others could fight. Good soldiers, but not trained to be hunted. Luke was proud of that. He talked about efficiency, about improvements they had made to storage flow and vehicle turnaround times. I listened and nodded in the right places. Inside, my eyes never stopped moving. I noticed how the perimeter dipped on the eastern side where the ground sloped away. I noticed a water tower outside the wire that offered clean sight lines into the heart of the compound. I noticed cameras angled inward, watching people instead of approaches. None of it was dramatic. None of it was wrong on its own. But patterns are not made of single mistakes. They are made of small things lining up. Luke gave me a quick tour. Motor pools, barracks, the dining facility where the food smelled better than it tasted. Soldiers laughed. Someone argued about cards. It looked like a place that expected tomorrow. That night, I lay on a narrow bed in the visitor quarters and stared at the ceiling. I told myself I was projecting, that I had been away too long, that I was seeing threats where there were only routines. I repeated the same thought I used back home when a car idled too long outside my studio. You are safe now. But my body did not agree. I woke twice to sounds I could not place. Engines cutting off too cleanly in the distance. A metallic clink that echoed wrong. Each time, I sat up and listened until my pulse slowed. I did not wake Luke. I did not call anyone. I had no authority there, and authority without evidence only creates friction. In the morning, Luke teased me for looking tired. I told him the mattress was bad. That was easier than explaining the weight sitting between my shoulder blades. I had come to Redfield as a sister. I planned to leave as one. But even then, before the first round ever landed, I knew something was off. Not enough to panic. Not enough to run. Just enough to matter. And sometimes, that is how the worst nights begin. The warning signs were small enough that most people walked past them without slowing down. Patrols moved on clean schedules and never varied their routes. The same boots hit the same gravel at the same times every night. It looked disciplined. It was actually predictable. Outside the wire, a water tower stood on slightly higher ground, old and rusted, with a clear view into the center of the compound. Nobody talked about it. It had been there forever, which meant it had faded into the background. The cameras bothered me more. Most of them were pointed inward, watching traffic flow, motor pools, entry points between buildings. Good for order, bad for warning. You could feel the base watching itself instead of the space around it. At dinner that night, Luke introduced me to a few officers from logistics and operations. They were good people, tired, competent in the way people get when their jobs depend on routines working the same way every day. Someone joked about another drone going offline earlier that week. Someone else blamed a software update. There was laughter. The kind that says this has happened before and nothing bad came of it. I listened and ate slowly. Lost drones. Sensors dropping out. Patrols shortened because nothing ever happened. None of those things meant trouble on their own. Together, they formed a rhythm I recognized. Observation first. Testing second. Silence before pressure. I asked one careful question about the water tower, framing it like curiosity instead of concern. The answer came back relaxed. Cameras covered the approaches. Patrols passed it twice a day. Nothing ever showed up there. The conversation moved on. Luke caught my eye and smiled, the same way he used to when I got quiet at family gatherings. Later, when we walked back toward the barracks, he nudged my shoulder and told me I was doing that thing again. The thing where I scanned rooftops and windows like I was expecting someone to wave back. I told him I was fine, that teaching self-defense made me jumpy. He laughed and said I had always been like this. I let it go because pushing only hardens walls. That night, I could not sleep. Just after midnight, I heard engines in the distance. Not loud, not close. They cut off too cleanly, like someone who knew exactly when to kill the sound. A few minutes later, I caught a brief flash from the edge of my window, not light. Reflection, metal catching moonlight and then disappearing. I sat up and waited. Nothing happened. No alarms, no voices. The base breathed the way it always did. I told myself I was projecting, that I had trained my mind to fill in blanks with danger because that used to keep people alive. I lay back down and stared at the ceiling until my breathing slowed. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was Luke shaking my shoulder just before dawn. He said I had been talking in my sleep. I asked him what I said. He told me it was nothing he could understand. Just numbers. The day passed without incident. Vehicles rolled in and out. Maintenance crews argued over parts. Someone played music too loud from an open bay. Life kept going, and that made it harder to trust my instincts. There is a special kind of doubt that comes from being the only person who feels something tightening. In the late afternoon, I walked the perimeter with Luke under the excuse of wanting fresh air. He pointed out recent improvements with the pride of someone who had worked hard to make a place function. I nodded and asked harmless questions. Inside, I counted distances and noted blind spots. When we passed the eastern side, the wind shifted and carried a smell that did not belong. Diesel. Faint. Recent. I stopped walking. Luke took 2 more steps before noticing. He turned and asked what was wrong. I told him I thought a vehicle had passed recently outside the wire. He looked where I pointed and shrugged. There was nothing to see, just scrub and broken concrete. He told me again that I was overthinking, that Redfield had never taken indirect fire, that the nearest hostile activity was far enough away to be someone else's problem. He said it kindly, not dismissively. That made it worse. That evening, as the sun dropped and shadows stretched long between buildings, the base grew quieter than it should have. Radios chirped less. Conversations shortened. It was not fear. It was absence. Like a pause held too long in a sentence. I stood outside the barracks and listened. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, metal scraped against metal. Somewhere closer, a door slammed and echoed longer than it should have. I told myself again that I was just a visitor, a sister, someone without a role. But silence has weight, and it had started to settle in the wrong places. By the time night fully set in, I was no longer trying to convince myself that nothing was coming. I was waiting to see how it would begin. The escalation did not announce itself. There was no siren, no shouted warning that split the air. It started the way real trouble often does, with small failures that felt almost unrelated. A generator on the west side dropped offline without explanation. Lights flickered, then steadied. Someone muttered about maintenance and moved on. A few minutes later, communications stuttered. Radios worked, then did not. Voices clipped in and out like someone was pinching the line. A patrol missed a routine check-in window. Not long enough to panic, long enough to notice. I was standing near the vehicle yard with Luke when the first round landed. It did not scream in. It arrived with a heavy, concussive thud that shook the ground under our boots and knocked breath out of my chest. Dirt and metal rattled down from somewhere above us. For a second, nobody moved. Then someone yelled, and the base snapped into motion. The second round landed closer, still measured, still deliberate. This was not random fire. Someone was walking rounds in, testing distance, adjusting calmly. I could feel it in the spacing, in the timing. Whoever was firing knew exactly where they wanted to go. Orders came over the radio, fragmented and late. Take cover. Move to hardened positions. Secure fuel storage. The words overlapped and contradicted each other. Soldiers ran where they were told, not where they were safest. That is not a failure of courage. It is a failure of information. Luke grabbed my arm and tried to pull me toward a concrete barrier. I went with him, but my eyes were already tracking impacts, counting seconds between launches and strikes. Adjustments were being made faster than our responses. That gap was dangerous. Another round landed inside the wire. A guard tower went dark, its light snapping off like a switch had been thrown. I heard shouting from the direction of the barracks, then the sharp crack of small arms fire. Not panic shooting, controlled bursts. Someone had rehearsed this. I stayed quiet because I had no rank there and no authority to match my instincts. Shouting without clarity only adds noise, and noise kills people just as fast as hesitation. I watched instead. I listened. I waited for the moment when saying nothing would cost more than speaking. Communications degraded further. One channel went dead entirely. Another filled with overlapping voices. A sergeant tried to restore order, but the ground truth kept changing faster than his map. Vehicles started moving where they should not have. Lights came on where darkness would have been safer. A mortar hit near the maintenance area, and I felt the concussion ripple through my legs. Somewhere, glass shattered. Somewhere else, someone screamed and then went quiet. That sound cut deeper than the explosions. Luke crouched beside me, jaw tight, eyes searching for direction. He was doing everything he had been trained to do. That training just had not prepared him for a base being peeled apart piece by piece. I leaned close and told him to keep his people off the open lanes between buildings, to move through shadow and hard cover. I framed it like a suggestion, not an order. He nodded once and passed it on. It helped, but it was not enough. The attackers shifted fire. Mortars paused, then resumed on a new grid. That told me they were watching us adjust. They were learning in real time. The base was reacting. The enemy was shaping. Another generator failed. Darkness spread unevenly. In the gaps, muzzle flashes popped and vanished. Someone fired wildly from a doorway, and I winced. That kind of shooting draws attention like blood and water. A call came over the radio about movement near the fuel storage area. Luke went rigid. If that went up, it would not just kill people. It would erase the center of the base. He looked at me, searching for reassurance I could not give. I told him to slow down, to think before moving. He nodded again, but his body was already leaning forward. Duty pulls harder than fear. As we moved, another round landed close enough to throw us both off balance. My ears rang. My vision tunneled. For a moment, everything narrowed to sound and pressure. In that narrowing, clarity arrived. This was not an attack meant to scare. It was meant to dismantle. Communications first. Power second. Movement channels third. They were isolating pieces of the base and applying pressure until something catastrophic broke. And in that moment, crouched in the dirt beside my brother, I understood something I had been trying to avoid since I arrived. If someone did not disrupt their control soon, Redfield was going to turn into a series of small, silent endings scattered across the dark. I was still quiet. But I was no longer waiting. When the call came in about movement near the fuel storage area, Luke did not hesitate. He took off at a run, helmet loose, radio bouncing against his chest. I went after him without thinking. That was the moment I crossed back into something I had spent years convincing myself I was done with. The fuel storage sat low, tucked between concrete walls and stacked containers. It was supposed to be protected by distance and assumption. As we moved, I could already see how wrong that was. Shadows shifted where they should not have. The air smelled sharp, like metal and hot dust. Someone was already firing, short controlled bursts aimed at anything that tried to move in the open. A guard stumbled out from behind a barrier and went down hard. He had been hit in the leg, bleeding fast, eyes wide and unfocused. Luke dropped beside him, calling for a medic that could not answer. I knelt too, hands already working. I tied off the bleeding, talked the guard through breathing, kept my voice low and steady. When I finished, I reached for his rifle. I did not ask. I checked the chamber out of habit, felt the weight settle into my shoulder like something familiar and unwelcome. The guard watched me with confusion, then relief. He nodded once. That was enough. Luke looked at me, startled, then angry. He started to say my name. I cut him off and told him to move 2 steps left and stay off the open lane. I told him now. Not loud, not pleading. Certain. He did it without thinking, and a second later, rounds chewed into the concrete where he had been standing. That got his attention. From that point on, things moved quickly. I pointed. People moved. I told a driver to kill his headlights and rolled the truck back 10 yards. I told 2 soldiers to stack behind a container and wait for my signal. I did not explain why. Explanations cost time, and time was the one thing we did not have. Someone tried to argue. I met his eyes and told him to trust me for 30 seconds. He did. 30 seconds later, fire swept the spot he would have crossed. He did not argue again. The attackers were probing, looking for a chain reaction. One lucky hit on the fuel tanks would have done their work for them. I could see the angles they were using, the way they shifted when we adjusted. They were disciplined, not rushed. That made them dangerous. I fired only when I had to. Short bursts, nothing wasted. Each shot was meant to buy space, not win a fight. Luke stayed close, relaying what I said without asking where it came from. I could feel him struggling with it, with the sudden shift in roles, but he did not slow down. That mattered. A mortar landed closer than the rest, close enough to knock us flat. My ears rang and my mouth tasted like dirt. I rolled, came up on one knee, checked Luke, then checked the fuel tanks, still intact. Still breathing. We pushed the attackers back far enough to break their momentum, but it cost us. One soldier took shrapnel in the shoulder. Another went down hard and did not get back up. I did not have time to grieve him then. I logged the loss somewhere deep and moved on. At some point, someone yelled my name. I did not know how they knew it. I did not answer. Names make things personal, and personal gets people killed. When the pressure eased even slightly, Luke grabbed my arm. He demanded to know what I was doing. Who I thought I was. I told him later. Not now. He looked like he wanted to argue. Then another burst of fire snapped overhead, and the moment passed. We held the fuel area long enough for the attackers to shift focus. That was the best we could do. When the fire slackened, I handed the rifle back to the guard who had been hit. He tried to refuse. I closed his fingers around it and told him he would need it. He nodded again, jaw tight. As we moved away, I realized my hands were steady. That scared me more than the incoming fire. I had not been brave. Bravery implies choice. This was something else. This was muscle memory. Pattern recognition. The quiet certainty that comes from having been here before and knowing exactly how bad it could get. I had crossed a line, and there was no pretending I had not. Not anymore. The worst part came after the noise settled into a pattern. Mortars paused. Small arms fire stretched out, controlled, patient. Radios were mostly dead now, reduced to bursts of static and half-sentences that went nowhere. Ammunition was being counted in low voices, not out loud, but everyone was doing the math. Help was not close. Everyone knew it. Nobody wanted to say it. We took cover behind a row of storage containers while Luke tried to raise anyone higher. He kept his voice calm, professional, like tone alone could stitch the night back together. No answer came back. Somewhere nearby, someone was crying without sound. That scared me more than shouting would have. Then a runner stumbled in from the north side, breath ragged, face gray with dust. He said there were people trapped in the administrative building near the old loading docks. Oh! Wounded, pinned. Taking sustained fire from 2 angles. The building had thin walls and too many windows. Whoever was shooting had figured that out quickly. There was no clean route in. Everyone knew that too. The small group we had left looked at Luke. Luke looked at me. I did not wait for the question. I said I would go. Not loudly. Not dramatically. I said it the way you state a fact that cannot be argued. Hesitation kills faster than bullets. I had learned that the hard way. We moved while the fire shifted, using the gaps between bursts. I stayed low, counted steps, listened for reloads. The closer we got, the thicker the smoke became. Something inside the building was burning. Paper, plastic, old furniture. It mixed with the smell of blood and made my stomach turn. The first body I saw was just inside the doorway, alive but barely. Shrapnel had torn into his thigh. He was trying not to scream. I pressed my hand against the wound and told him to look at me. He did. I told him to breathe when I told him to breathe. He did that too. Rounds snapped through the doorway, chewing plaster and throwing dust into our eyes. I dragged him back behind cover inch by inch, every movement slow and deliberate. When I handed him off to someone outside, I did not watch what happened next. Watching costs time. Inside, the building felt smaller than it should have. Smoke clung low, forcing us to crouch. Glass crunched under boots. Someone was praying out loud in a corner. Someone else was trying to keep pressure on a chest wound with shaking hands. I took control without announcing it. I pointed. People moved. I asked who could still walk. I told those who could not to stay down and stay quiet. I did not sugarcoat anything. Comfort is a luxury when rounds are coming through walls. We moved the first two out during a lull. Timing mattered more than speed. I waited until the firing shifted slightly, then waved them forward. They made it halfway before fire picked up again. I dragged one back by his vest and shoved him through the doorway on the next break. He did not thank me. That was fine. The third run was worse. A burst caught the corner of the building and the pressure slammed into my head like a fist. Sound dropped out on one side completely. Just gone. For a moment I thought I had blacked out. Then I realized I was still moving. My ears rang. My balance went soft. I tasted blood. I forced myself to slow down, to move carefully. Panic would finish what the blast had started. I do not remember every face. I remember hands. Hands gripping my sleeve. Hands shaking too hard to hold pressure. Hands that went slack when it was too late. At one point, I made a decision that still wakes me up. 2 wounded. One could move with help. One could not. The firing was tightening. I chose the one who could move. I told the other I would be back. I do not know if he believed me. I do not know if it mattered. When we finally cleared the building, I collapsed against the wall outside and slid down until I was sitting in the dirt. Someone shouted my name. Someone else pressed something cold into my hands. I could not hear them clearly anymore. Everything sounded distant, like I was underwater. Luke crouched in front of me and grabbed my shoulders. His mouth was moving fast. I read his words instead of hearing them. "Are you hit? Are you hit? Are you hit?" I shook my head, then nodded, then shook it again. It was easier to let him decide what that meant. We had gotten them out. Not all of them. Not all of them. Enough to matter. Enough to keep the night from swallowing that corner of the base whole. As we moved back into cover, the ringing in my ears settled into a constant, high sound that never went away. I knew then that something permanent had been taken. Hearing. Balance. A piece of distance between me and the worst decisions. I did not have time to think about it. The night was not done yet. But even then, part of me understood the cost. Some things you pay once. Some things you carry forever. The turning point did not feel heroic. It felt necessary. Someone mentioned the water tower again, almost as an afterthought, while we huddled behind cover and waited for the next adjustment in fire. When they said it, everything finally aligned in my head. The angles, the timing, the way the mortars paused just long enough for movement to begin, then resumed exactly where it would hurt most. This was not random pressure. It was directed. I said the words before I fully thought them through. They are controlling it from elevation. Luke looked at me, then followed my eyes. The tower stood outside the wire, dark against the night, higher than anything else around it. From there, you could see almost everything that mattered. Vehicle lanes, command buildings, the fuel area. Whoever held that view did not need chaos. They needed patience. I told Luke I could climb it. He shook his head immediately, too exposed. Too far, too obvious. I agreed with him on all counts. Then I told him that if we did not break their control, the base was going to keep losing people one pocket at a time until there was nothing left to hold. He did not answer right away. He was doing his own math. Finally, he nodded once, not as my brother. As an officer out of options. We moved during a lull, slipping through shadow and broken ground beyond the perimeter. Every step felt louder than it should have. My ear rang constantly now, a thin, high sound that made it harder to judge distance. I adjusted by watching instead of listening. The tower ladder was old steel, rusted in places, cold under my hands. I tested each rung before committing weight. Halfway up, I froze as fire shifted below. Rounds cracked past, close enough that I felt air move. I stayed still and waited. Waiting is a skill people underestimate. When I reached the top, the world changed. From up there, the base stopped being a maze and became a map. I could see how the attackers were positioned, how fire was being directed, how movement on our side triggered immediate response. I spotted the command element almost right away, tucked into a reinforced structure with a clear view of the compound. That was the brain. Everything else was muscle. I settled in and slowed my breathing. I did not think about what this meant. I thought about mechanics. Wind, distance, stability. My hands were steady. I noticed that too and pushed the thought aside. The first shot was not dramatic. No pause, no internal speech. Just a clean squeeze and a sharp recoil. The figure near the command position went down hard and did not get back up. I watched. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then movement spiked. People shifted. Someone tried to take control. I adjusted and fired again. After the second shot, the rhythm broke. Fire that had been coordinated turned uneven. Mortar stopped entirely. Small arms fire lost its timing. The pressure on the base eased so suddenly it was almost disorienting. It was like watching a machine seize when a single gear snaps. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt urgency. I stayed on the tower longer than I should have, correcting where it mattered most. I targeted leaders trying to re-establish control. I took out a position that had been pinning a group near the motor pool. Each shot was a calculation about whose life would matter most in the next few minutes. Then the return fire started to tighten. Someone had spotted the tower. Rounds smacked into the metal supports, sending vibrations through the structure. I knew the clock had started. I fired one last shot to cover movement below, then began my descent. Halfway down, the tower shuddered as something heavy struck near the base. The ladder shook. Rust flakes fell into my eyes. I did not rush. Rushing makes mistakes. When my boots hit the ground, Luke was there, eyes wide. He grabbed me and pulled me behind cover without a word. We stayed down as rounds snapped overhead, then shifted when the firing moved elsewhere. The base felt different immediately. Not safe, but no longer bleeding. Orders started to make sense again. Movement had purpose. Wounded were moved without taking fire. People who had been pinned suddenly had space to breathe. Control is fragile. People forget that. It feels solid until the moment it collapses, and then it vanishes all at once. We did not win anything that night. We survived long enough for help to matter. That was enough. I leaned back against the dirt and closed my eyes for a second. The ringing in my ear was louder now. My hands finally started to shake. I let them. The night was not over yet, but the shape of it had changed, and sometimes that is the only victory you get. Relief arrived after sunrise, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The sound of rotors cut through the morning air and settled into the bones of everyone still standing. Vehicles rolled in carefully, like the ground might bite back. Medics moved fast and quiet, stepping around craters, bloodstains, and things nobody had the energy to clean yet. When the shooting stopped for good, the damage became impossible to ignore. A guard tower burned down to twisted metal. One administrative building was gutted, its windows blown out, papers plastered to the pavement by smoke and rain. The motor pool looked like it had aged 10 years overnight. There were bodies laid out under ponchos, spaced with care. I counted without meaning to. I always do. Some of the wounded were flown out immediately. Others waited on stretchers, eyes fixed on the sky like it might explain what had just happened. The base felt hollow, like a place that had exhaled and not yet figured out how to breathe again. Luke found me near the edge of the compound, sitting on a concrete block with my back against a fence. I was holding a cup of water I kept forgetting to drink. My hands were finally shaking, the adrenaline bleeding off in uneven waves. He stood in front of me for a long time before either of us spoke. When he did, it was not to thank me. It was not to ask questions. He just said my name, the way he used to when we were kids, and he needed to know I was really there. I looked up at him and saw something settle behind his eyes. Not pride, not fear. Understanding. That mattered more than anything else he could have given me. Later, officers I did not know approached quietly. They asked careful questions. They made careful offers. Words like debrief and consultation floated around without landing. I answered what I had to. I refused what I could. I told them I was a civilian. I meant it. Someone mentioned opportunities. Someone else mentioned service. I told them I had already paid for mine. They did not argue. By midday, the base was loud again. Generators hummed. Radios crackled with actual information. People moved with purpose, even if their faces were older now. I watched Luke walk with his soldiers, checking in, listening more than talking. He moved differently, too. So did I. I left Redfield that afternoon. There was no ceremony, no goodbye formation. Luke hugged me hard, longer than usual, and told me to drive safe. I told him to come home. We both knew what those words really meant. Oregon felt unreal when I got back. The trees were too green. The air smelled wrong. My studio door stuck the way it always had, and for a moment I stood there with my hand on the handle, unsure how to step back into a life that did not involve counting exits. I taught classes again. I showed people how to break holds, how to keep distance, how to notice when something felt off. I did not tell stories. I did not need to. The lessons carried enough weight on their own. Some nights, I woke up convinced I could hear the low thump of mortars walking in. I would sit up, heart racing, waiting for the second round. It never came. Eventually, I learned how to breathe through it, how to remind myself where I was. I never went back to Redfield. I did not need to. The place stayed with me in quieter ways. In the ringing in my ear, in the way I flinched at sudden light, in the understanding that survival is not a clean thing. I did not regret going there. I did not regret leaving. Both choices cost something. I never wanted to be the person who changed how a night ended. I wanted to be someone who never had to measure distance in the dark again, someone whose hands stayed steady only because life was calm. But life does not care about intentions. It only cares about what you do when there is no time left to choose who you are. That night at Redfield Support Base, I did not save the world. I did not win anything. I bought time. Time for wounded soldiers to be pulled into cover. Time for fire to lose its rhythm. Time for help to arrive before the base collapsed into something it could not recover from. Sometimes, that is the only kind of victory there is. When it was over, I walked away again. Not because I was afraid of what I had done, but because I understood the cost of staying. Walking away was not denial. It was discipline. It was choosing not to let the worst night of my life decide every day that followed. Some skills never leave you. They settle in like old scars, quiet until pressure finds them again. You learn to live around them. You learn to carry them without letting them speak for you. And when the moment comes, you decide whether those skills own you or whether you still get to choose the life you build afterward. I chose to leave. I chose to be a sister, a teacher, and a woman who understands what survival really asks for. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.